And now for a special edition of Atlantic Reads. Here to discuss their new book, Abundance. Please welcome the co-authors, Derek Thompson and Ezra Klein. Here to lead the conversation is Annie Lowrey, staff writer at The Atlantic.
Okay, thank you everybody for being here. My understanding is that they did not mention in the introduction, and just so everybody knows, Ezra and I are married. We've been married for a very long time. So I was making a couple jokes about how I'm just going to cut him off and just dunk on him incessantly. And I was like, if the audience didn't have that information, this could be extremely awkward. Like, wow, you're really rude to the invited guests of The Atlantic. Oh my goodness. Okay, so I want to talk about abundance in this moment, where I think that I had thought, and probably a lot of us in this room had thought, that we would be talking about abundance in terms of a Democratic Party that feels like it has a little bit lost its way, and a Republican Party that is moving to deregulate and bring a lot more production back to the United States. And instead, we are in this moment in which it seems like we might actually even possibly have a recession thanks to an enormous set of tariffs that now apply to every single American trading partner. And so I want to hear both of you update your book for this moment now, right? Like, how are you situating this now that we have this policy environment that is not the one that I think we thought it was going to be 3 months ago?
Shall I begin?
Yes, Derek.
Okay. Look, I think this book would have been somewhat awkward to position if Donald Trump became president and said, I've just won an election that's all about unaffordability. And at the heart of unaffordability is unaffordability of homes. And so the first thing I'm going to do is create a, blue ribbon commission to figure out all the ways we can reduce housing prices, beginning with reducing the price of the most important inputs for housing, like wood and drywall. And instead, he goes in the entire opposite direction and raises tariffs on Canadian lumber and drywall that we get from Mexico. You could also imagine a position in which we'd be in sort of an uncomfortable place if Republicans came into power and said the one thing we need to do is to make it cheaper to manufacture things in America. Because the one thing we have to do to become bigger and richer and stronger as a country is to build and build and build. And so we need a true abundance agenda. So we're going to reduce the price of building stuff in America. Instead, as Annie perfectly reviewed, we raised tariffs on all of our trading partners, thus guaranteeing that the inputs that manufacturers buy in order to make the stuff that they sell or export, those got more expensive. So now the cost of manufacturing is rising in America, and every single manufacturer that various Fed surveys are asking, hey, how's manufacturing going for you? How do you think it's going to go in the next few months? Are saying, respectively, absolutely terribly and even worse. So there's clearly a world in which the message of liberal abundance would have been complicated by the clear juxtaposition to an excellent version of conservative abundance. And unfortunately for America, and narrowly fortunately for our book, that didn't happen. And the president is pursuing a kind of aggressive and chaotic and almost cartoonish scarcity agenda. We don't have enough manufacturing, we need less immigration. We need less trade. We don't have enough housing, we need less immigration. Every scarcity he's identifying some other thing that we need less of. And so fortunately...
Less dollar dominance.
Less dollar dominance.
Less Fed independence. We can go down the line.
Sing it, yeah.
Less tax revenue?
You should have why didn't you write this book? This is what I
mean,
Danny GPT. Yeah, sorry. There you go.
It's a very fulsome acknowledgement at the end.
I only see.
It made me uncomfortable.
I only see what Ezra emails. I can't see the inputs. So yeah, the answer is a little bit funny, but honestly, like profoundly sorrowful that the example being set by the Trump administration is the paragon of a scarcity agenda, and its juxtaposition with abundance, I think, just couldn't be any clearer.
Yeah. Do you have anything to add to that, Ezra?
Welcome to the only stop on the tour where the moderator could actually hurt my feelings. Only moderator I actually fear. I'm not going to add on tariffs because Derek is so good at talking about tariffs. I will talk about Doge for a second, though, because here we have this whole book that is very substantially arguing that Democrats have allowed the state to be too bureaucratic, too lawful, too careful, too procedural. And then here comes this administration that says, what if we light all of that on fire? And so that was not expected at that level. The other policies, I think, more or less, like, I believed he would do the tariffs. I didn't think they'd be quite this stupid. I didn't think we would tariff penguins, but I did think we would do tariffs. Elon Musk's Doge was something else, and it has created this sort of interesting challenge. Like, well, is this what you're talking about? And no. The fact that a patient would benefit from surgery doesn't mean they'll benefit from a stabbing. And Doge is a stabbing of the government. But it has loosened the Democratic Party up in a very interesting way. At the beginning, they were saying this to me privately. Now a number have said it publicly. But Democrats have developed a kind of interesting Doge envy. They don't want to do what Doge is doing. They don't want to try to pursue the end Doge is pursuing, which is an ideological purge of the government, a destruction of state capacity. But the recognition that they had hamstrung themselves with rules that were actually norms, with laws that were not actually enforceable, by listening to everything every lawyer said, even when it was only an advisory opinion of an advisory opinion of an advisory opinion, it has changed their thinking about what is possible. Both the fact that if your government is not effective, you might lose the election. Losing the election doesn't mean Mitt Romney and his team comes in. It might mean you lose liberal democracy. But also losing the election and realizing, when is the last time, it has not happened in my lifetime, when the thing people are saying about a president is he's doing too much of what he promised, right? Every Obama, Clinton, like every Biden, it's always about, well, you got to accept a quarter loaf. American government is complicated. And here the thing is, like, this guy's driving at 95 miles an hour, even his own people wish he was going at 50. So the Democratic Party is in a very different place on what you can do inside the state than it was. And if we make it through this, I think it has really changed what is possible for state capacity reform.
Yeah, and I would encourage, the book is filled with these enraging examples of how these processes can get hung up. And I would encourage everybody to read the book, and more importantly, for my household and Derek's, to purchase it. So now I want to move forward into a world in which maybe you have a Democratic Party that feels less constrained by their own rules, that feels less like they are generators of red tape, that everybody needs to be consulted for every single step. And it's a world where you really can start building things again. One of the questions that I came away from the book with is that's still a world in which you have very, very wealthy homeowners. And you have local governments that are elected primarily by those wealthy homeowners. How do you build things if we have not just created a veto internal to the government, but given a veto to people who have power, time, and money, individuals and businesses both?
Well, it's not easy. The problem you've identified is a problem. And in a way, it's almost not a problem that's solvable here with like the right sequence of words on this stage. It's going to be solved, I think, by several forces. One is organizing, right? Local politics is sometimes thought of as being a more democratic form of politics. It's more Jeffersonian in a way. People have more control over what happens in their town or their state than they do at the national level. But in many ways, local politics is somewhat less democratic than national politics, in that the typical local election tends to elicit about 10 to 15% of the electorate, whereas national quadrennial elections, presidential elections, elicit 50 to 60 to 65% of the electorate. So in many cases, one of the problems with local elections is that the population of people that are affected by laws aren't the population of people that appear at the polls in order to vote on those who will make the laws. And so that raises the possibility that one answer here is an answer of organizing. That if you can find a way to have certain groups, and YIMBY, the YIMBY groups that exist around America are already trying to do this at the local level, to go around and talk to non-voters and get them on a list and tell them we're going to activate you on certain days, especially when there's a primary or especially when it's a week or a month before an election and on election day. And that's just straightforward organizing. So there's one vector here, one plank of the strategy. It's sort of old-fashioned organizing. Not enough people are showing up to represent their interests at the polls, and we need more people to show up because otherwise the polls are going to be overrepresented by the rich homeowner elite. That's one possibility. There's another tranche of the strategy that, this is the cliche, that it's all about either persuasion or turnout. So now I guess I talked about turnout, I have to talk about persuasion. I really do believe deeply that that NIMBYs, that people who don't want local housing construction, are, like every other person, profoundly torn in their preferences. They live with a set of conflicting principles. One of those principles is, I don't want a lot of change around me. And when I see an apartment building or the beginning of an apartment construction down the block, I think this is going to be a noise, this is going to be traffic, this is going to be a headache for me. But a lot of these people live with this other desire, that they want their local community to have affordable housing so that their friends can move nearer to them, or their children can live in the same city as them because there's enough housing to accommodate entire families living in an area, even when all of them don't make $1 million a year. So people, I think, are complicated. YIMBYs are complicated, and so are NIMBYs. And I think that there's a way that the argument of abundance can force people to think in a more expansive way about the fact that local housing construction isn't just about the noise you hear when those steel frames are going up. It's also about the people who can live in that community and can enrich your community in the future. So I really do think that there is an enormous role for persuasion here, and I don't want I don't want to lean too much on the turnout argument to simply say NIMBYs will be NIMBYs. There is a way, I think, to make people see the bigger argument. And one last thing that I would say is that, we live with a set of different defaults where, for example, very few people who send their children to private school say, well, I send my children to a private school so I don't have to pay local taxes for education, right? Because the default in that community is that everyone pays local taxes that pay for education. And in the same way, there's defaults in some states or some cities where neighbors don't have as much power to determine what's built down the street from them. And in a way, I think we can also ask people to have a more capacious sense of housing justice, the way people have a sense of school justice, which is to say, you have a right to live in your home, but there's also there's a higher principle here that more housing should be built in the city. And it's actually somewhat, I used this term before, but it's actually somewhat gauche to be against housing. It's actually somewhat rude. It's not normal to be against new housing construction in this way. And so I do really think that cultural wars can be won in the arena of persuasion, in addition to the necessary work that needs to be done in organizing.
Okay. Ezra, do you have thoughts on this? I had seen that you were raising your mic, but then I don't know.
I feel like you get into this, I do. I have a million thoughts on everything, as you know, but you can get into this abundance of answers problem. So I'm going to let you ask another question.
It should be an abundance of answers. That is kind of broadly the point here. One of the things that, Derek, that brought up for me a little bit is that we have been in a world where scarcity has been most obvious in terms of prices, I think. And we might be in a world actually where there's about to be true shortages. This was true in COVID. And I think that one thing that happened during COVID was that inflation made the cost of living crisis much more salient to people. They noticed it way more because of the price of eggs. Somehow they hadn't noticed their insurance premiums, but they really, really noticed the eggs. And I think that we're about to have some version of this because I do not know that I think it is quite likely that we will have material shortages of certain goods on shelves in a month or two. And I think that this might actually act as an additional prompt for oh goodness, right? You don't really see it in housing, but it's nevertheless, right? These markets work in not completely dissimilar ways.
One framing argument in the book, and this was very influenced by a piece Annie wrote in 2020, a month before COVID, called The Affordability Crisis. One framing argument in the book is that we have come through a period of arguably decades when economic politics in this country was about demand. It was about wages, it was about the number of jobs, about unemployment. And this is particularly true after the financial crisis. You talk to Obama-era economists and all they would tell you is about demand, demand, demand. We need more demand. And we have entered, and this is sort of post-COVID, but it was building before that with this affordability crisis, as Andy named it, in healthcare and elder care and housing and childcare, in all these things that are not consumer goods, but are things you need to build a life. There was this pressure, this cost pressure building in an economy that otherwise looked pretty good. And then you had COVID, you had inflation. This sort of went through like what I call like the saliency portal. The eye of Sauron that is American politics moved to something else. It moved to how much things cost. And the perennial raging frustration of the Biden people is that even towards the end of that election, when inflation, the rate of inflation had come down to a more normal level, people were not okay with it. They were not happy with it. They were not going to give up on the idea that everything was now too expensive. But behind that, they were noticing it. Now we're about to go through another, I mean, this one by choice, optionally. It's completely insane. But we're going to go through another administration where they're going to drive the prices of things up. We are in an era of American politics that is not about demand, it is about supply. We have plenty of demand, we have insufficient supply. Sometimes that supply is insufficient because of shortages from pandemics. Sometimes it is insufficient because of long-term cost pressures that have built inside the economy. Sometimes it is insufficient because of tariffs. Sometimes it is insufficient because we are just in an era where we need resiliency that we didn't have before. But the reality is we had better tools and we had a more developed politics around demand than we have around supply. And so one reason I think there's been some electricity around the book Abundance, but not only that, there's been other things like this too, YIMBYs and many other things, is that the political system, a little bit on both sides, is trying to figure out its language and its policies for a new era. You cannot meet the problems of the 2020s with the politics of the 1980s. You can't even meet it with the politics of the 2010s. Different periods of different problems, they need different language. And you need lenses that let you see different things. There are still demand problems in the economy. But the reality is that unless you have something now to say about housing supply, how to make it possible for 30-year-olds to buy homes, you don't have anything to say. And that was actually a big problem for Kamala Harris. She came in, first presidential candidate in some time, to really put at the center of her campaign building more homes. But I, for my sins, read that policy package, and it would not have built 3 million new homes. It would not have come close. And so you're in this period where politics needs to reboot itself for a time when the problems cannot all be solved by minimum wage and EITC increases. When the issue is not just that we need to pump demand in the economy because we have negative real interest rates. We are going to have to make enough of the things people need so the prices on them are things people can afford. And the truth is, like, one party, the Democratic Party, began recognizing that, but isn't there yet. And the other party, the Republican Party, for God knows what reason, threw itself into reverse on the question. Like, they could have owned this, and they've decided to light themselves on fire over it. It's the greatest political opportunity. Like, it might save democracy that Donald Trump has insane theories about the macroeconomy. But that's where we are.
Yeah. So I want to ask about saliency and visibility in another way, because the book has a lot of discussion of green policies, of making sure that we are in a future where climate change does not imperil the human species on this planet. But the Biden administration did a lot of work to create green energy. But one thing I was thinking about, right, like when you turn a light on, you probably have no idea what power generated it. You might not even really notice if the car that you're in has a gas engine or a diesel engine or an electric engine. I'm not a person who thinks a lot about these things, as you can tell. And one thing that I think that we saw was, for all of the Biden administration's great efforts spending hundreds of billions of dollars on green energy, it wasn't necessarily going to be very visible to voters for two reasons. One is that it was going to take a long time to build. And the second is changing the mix of energy inputs is invisible to people. And so how do you deal with that problem, even if power shortages are visible, hurricanes, all of these other downstream consequences?
Well, there's two parts to it. One is that the Biden administration only completed the first half of a necessary clean energy revolution. The first part, and I love this sort of like, it's like how a bill becomes a law like story of energy. It's like how a hydrocarbon becomes a jewel. It would be like the sort of the way the storybook would go. But like this idea that you're totally right, that the energy has to be created. The photovoltaic cell has to convert sunlight that splashes into silicon into an electric current. But then a wire has to carry that electric current to the place that the energy, once created, can ultimately be consumed. And therefore, you can't have a policy that's just focused on the production of that energy. You actually have to transmit it to the final consumer. That means you can't just have an Inflation Reduction Act that pays for a lot of clean energy to be produced. You also need a way to send that electricity across transmission wires that crisscross the country. And while the Biden administration was very vocal about its support for the Inflation Reduction Act, it was not, I think, as vocal about its support for necessary permitting reform to build transmission lines that take that electricity from where it's created to where it's finally consumed. There's a way in which this is all kind of boring. And that is precisely to Annie's point, that energy is not something that someone wakes up and thinks God, I really want to figure out where the energy that made my coffee a little bit hotter ultimately came from. Was it this natural gas? Was it this coal mine? Some of this stuff is necessarily invisible. Even the wires themselves are invisible. You plug, the machine into the socket and you can't even see the wires that are delivering the energy to that machine. For that reason, what you need, I think, is a public policy that encourages the production and transmission of energy without asking Americans to clamor for it to come from solar rather than hydrocarbons like coal and natural gas. You have to find ways to work out the economics of scale of these technologies. And fortunately, we're in a world where this is not the 1970s, where solar power and wind power are 10 times more expensive than coal and natural gas and oil. We live in this miraculous world where learning curves have brought down the cost of solar and wind to the point that in many cases they're now cheaper to create energy from than the old hydrocarbons and from just burning stuff that we find in the ground. So the opportunity is there. And frankly, the opportunity is there for someone like Burgum and a abundance conservative to say, what we want fundamentally is energy abundance for America. Ezra and I would prefer that in the long run that be made from solar and wind and geothermal and nuclear. But if you're a Republican, you could have said we want an all of the above strategy. You want to create energy however it can be created. Instead, again, they've done the opposite. They've tried to find a way to destroy the Inflation Reduction Act. It seems to me almost primarily because Joe Biden happened to sign his name to it. It's as Ezra said, the horse of an ideological purge is carrying the cart of energy policy. And so just because we want to purge progressive ideas from government, we therefore are against solar and wind, even though they're cheaper. It's an insane way, I think, to think about energy policy. But in the long run, I really do think the economics are going to win out. Oil is not a technology. Coal is not a technology. A piece of glass that can transmit the sun's rays into an electricity current that powers a car, that's a technology. And the rule of technology is that technology gets cheaper over time. So I am hopeful and optimistic that over time clean energy will win, but we need sensible actors in government that actually encourage that revolution to happen and don't throw their body across the train of the solar and wind revolution just because Joe Biden happened to have been driving the train.
I take the other piece of that, and he's right. Nobody knows where, we don't know what's powering that light. One thing that I think is actually a bigger move we're trying to make in our book, and that I think Democrats are starting to grapple with, is we've had the wrong goal for energy. The goal for energy has been somewhere between sacrifice and disaster prevention. It's either reduce, reuse, recycle, or decarbonize, because otherwise we're all going to go extinct. We've become, in a million different ways as liberals, energetic doomsayers. And doomsaying is a shit politics. It just doesn't work. And not only does it not work, it's not needed. The right goal isn't decarbonization. The right goal is green energy abundance. The right goal is clean energy that is, in fact, too cheap to meter. And a Democratic Party, a liberal coalition, whatever you want to call it, that sort of refocused, not on the question, it does need to take seriously what is powering the car, what is powering the light, what is powering the heat pump, but that internal battle is already won. What it should be trying to paint a picture of, though, for the country is what it would mean to have abundant clean energy. If there was no such thing as climate change, you still wouldn't want to burn coal. You still wouldn't want to burn oil. It kills, estimates have it, about 8 to 10 million people per year, roughly, through air pollution. Most of air pollution is the combustion of fossil fuels of some kind or another that we then breathe in, they coat our lungs, and they kill our children. And what you can do now, what we can see our way to, not just through wind and solar, but also through advanced nuclear, through advanced geothermal, through hydrofuel, through a bunch of different things, and we're starting to have the first successful tests of nuclear fusion. What you could see your way through to now is the possibility of a world where we have much more energy than we have now, and it is clean. And that is an astonishing world. Energy is the wellspring of wealth. If you made me choose between a society that has a lot of money and a society that has a lot of energy, well, money you could just inflate away. Energy is what really allows you to better your life. And so it's actually a pretty big deal to not just see energy. I think really the Democratic Party has been caught in a place where it sees bad energy and it sees good energy. And its vision is that we use the good energy and not the bad energy. I agree that we want to use the good energy and not the bad energy, but that's on the way to what we actually want for us and for the rest of the world, which is more energy to power better lives that have possibilities in them that we can't currently imagine.
All right. Unfortunately, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here in this abundant discussion.
More energy.
Yeah, more energy.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much.